On a map of Northern Europe, Tallinn sits closer to Helsinki than to Vilnius, a 40-minute ferry ride from Finland, a medieval walled town wrapped around a modern tech capital. If you moved here today, one specific line on your monthly budget would simply read zero. Not because the city is cheap, because of a single policy decision made by referendum in 2012, one this series will return to. Everything else about the cost of living here has moved in the opposite direction. This is the two-economy lens. The real cost applies to every city in this series. One economy belongs to the person who was born here, works for an Estonian employer, and is paid in the currency they've always used. The other belongs to the remote worker who arrived with a foreign salary, converts nothing, and experiences the same rental listings, the same grocery aisles, and the same visa office through a completely different set of constraints. Tallinn in 2026 makes that gap unusually visible because both economies are shifting at once. Numbio's cost of living index for 2026 placed Tallinn 182nd out of 479 cities worldwide, with a score of 64.8 against New York's baseline of 100. A year earlier, the same index had Tallinn at 138th, scoring 52.7. That is not a small movement. It means Tallinn is now recorded as costing more than Dubai, Rome, Montreal, Prague, and Budapest, cities that, on paper, most people would still call more expensive. Numbio's data is crowdsourced, which means it reflects what contributors choose to report, not a full statistical census. Estonia's own statistics agency doesn't publish an equivalent index. So take the ranking as a directional signal. Prices in Tallinn are climbing faster than in many comparison cities, rather than a precise global rank. Numbio's own estimator puts the monthly cost for a single resident, excluding rent, at €966.30. For a family of four, excluding rent, that estimate rises to €3,364.40. Those numbers cover groceries, transport, utilities, and everyday spending, not housing, which behaves as its own separate story in this city. A liter of milk costs €1.05. A dozen eggs, €2.76. A loaf of white bread, €1.25. On their own, these numbers say little. Compared with the rest of Northern Europe, they mark Tallinn as still holding some of the lowest grocery prices on the continent. Numbio ranks it first in the region for milk prices specifically. €1.28. That was the price of a dozen eggs in Tallinn in 2015, according to Numbio's historical data. The same dozen now costs €2.76, more than double in roughly a decade. A single grocery item that traces the same upward line as the city's broader cost of living index. Grocery shopping itself splits along a discount to premium spectrum familiar across the Baltics. Budget chains like Maxima and Rimi keep the milk and bread prices cited earlier close to the low end, while Selver and the newer Prisma hypermarkets sit closer to Western European pricing for imported goods and prepared foods. Where someone shops changes their monthly grocery bill by a meaningful margin, even within the same city. Eating out tells a different story. A meal at an inexpensive restaurant runs €15. A three-course dinner for two at a mid-range restaurant averages €80. A regular cappuccino costs €3.96. None of these figures are unusual for a European capital, but they no longer read as budget prices either. Basic utilities, electricity, heating, water, garbage, for an apartment around 85 square meters average €282.30 a month, with a reported range of €195 to €425. Heating costs specifically spike in winter, when Baltic temperatures push most buildings' bills toward the top of that range. A monthly mobile plan with 10 gigabytes or more of data averages €15.39. Broadband internet at 60 megabits per second or higher averages €28.13 a month. Modest costs in a country that consistently ranks among the most digitally connected in the EU. A pair of Levi's-style jeans costs €99.88. A monthly gym membership averages €45.26. A cinema ticket for an international release runs €12. These sit closer to Western European norms than to the discount pricing Tallinn was known for a decade ago. part of the same upward drift the 2026 Numbeo ranking captured. Estonia's minimum wage adds one more reference point. Those sources disagree slightly on the exact 2026 figure, reported anywhere from €886 to €946 a month, depending on whether the source reflects the January 2026 rate or a mid-year adjustment confirmed by government regulation effective that April. Either way, it sits far below both the national median and the income floor Estonia sets for remote workers wanting to move there, a gap this episode returns to in the visa section. None of these individual prices look dramatic in isolation. It's the direction that matters. Tallinn's cost of living index climbed by 12 points in a single year, a pace few Western European capitals matched over the same period, and one that shows no clear sign of leveling off going into the second half of 2026. €2,538. That is the official average gross monthly salary in Tallinn in the first quarter of 2026, according to Statistics Estonia, up from €2,384 the year before. Convert that gross figure toward take-home pay and it lands close to what crowdsourced platforms already report. Numbeo lists Tallinn's average net salary at €1,887.46 a month. Nationally, the picture is more modest. Estonia's median gross salary in Q1 2026 was €1,753, meaning half the country's workers earn less than that. On one side of this city's economy sits a Tallinn average pulled upward by information and communication salaries, which average over €3,000 a month. On the other side sits a rural or service sector worker earning closer to the €1,353 median recorded in Estonia's lowest-paying counties. A one-bedroom apartment in Tallinn's city center rents for an average of €715.94 a month, with a typical range of €600 to €850. Move outside the center, and that average drops to €520.67, ranging from €400 to €700. Family-sized housing scales the same way. A three-bedroom apartment in the center averages €1,363.75. Outside the center, €900.50. Both figures carry wide ranges, €1,000 to €2,000 in the center, because Tallinn's rental stock spans everything from Soviet-era panel housing to newly built glass towers. Families weighing a move face one more line item. Private full-day preschool runs an average of €591 a month, with a reported range of €300 to €812. International primary schooling, for families who need English language instruction, averages €9,166 a year, a cost concentrated almost entirely among foreign remote working families, since public Estonian schools serve local residents at no tuition cost at all. Set that €715.94 city center rent against the €1,887.46 average net salary Numbeo reports for local residents, and rent alone consumes just under 38% of a typical paycheck. High, but not unmanageable for someone earning the city average. Set the same rent against the national median net income, closer to €1,400 after tax for a Q1 2026 median earner, and that ratio climbs past 50%. And that's before anyone asks whether they're renting or trying to buy. Estonia's national average price per square meter for an apartment reached €2,211 in June 2026, according to Investropa's analysis of land board transaction data. That figure includes everywhere from Tallinn to small regional towns where, as the Estonian Land and Spatial Planning Department has noted, an average local salary can still buy a 20-square-meter apartment. Inside Tallinn itself, prices start climbing immediately. Budget-conscious districts like Lasnamäe run from around €2,200 per square meter, largely in Soviet-era panel buildings of varying renovation quality. Mustamäe's better-maintained buildings reach closer to €3,200 per square meter. Citywide, the secondary market, resale apartments, not new construction, averaged €2,871 per square meter in official land board data through 2025, a figure the market research firm Realting and Estonia's public broadcaster YARR both cite as essentially unchanged year over year. New-build apartments sit in an entirely different bracket. The average price for a newly constructed unit in Tallinn reached €4,540 per square meter in 2025, a 7% increase over 2024, driven partly by a VAT increase that took effect that July. These are not interchangeable numbers. A secondary market panel apartment in Lasnamäe and a new build unit in a central development are different products serving different buyers, and treating one figure as representative of Tallinn housing would misstate the market. Estimates that put the citywide median closer to €3,000 per square meter, as real estate research site Investropa does for early 2026, sit between these two segments, reflecting a blend of both. At the top end, renovated apartments in Kadriorg or Tallinn's Old Town, the kind with terraces, parking, and premium finishes, list between €600,000 and €1,500,000. In the Kalarana waterfront district, some listings have crossed €10,000 per square meter, according to figures cited by the Estonian Land and Spatial Planning Department. Numbio's price-to-income ratio for Tallinn stands at 10.75, meaning it would take roughly 11 years of full average income, with none of it spent on anything else, to buy an apartment outright. Mortgage payments, by the same dataset, are estimated to consume 77.65% of average income, a figure that flags Tallinn property as a stretch even for local earners at the average wage, let alone the median. The upward drift shows in longer trend lines too. Investment advisory firm Immigrant Invest reports that a 100 square meter apartment that sold for an average of €183,000 5 years ago now sells for around €273,000, a roughly 49% increase, tracking an average quarterly gain of 2.4% across the period. Buying that apartment as a foreigner is, procedurally, easier than in many EU countries. Estonia places no restrictions on non-EU citizens purchasing apartments in cities like Tallinn. The main limits apply to agricultural or forest land, and to a handful of border municipalities and small islands kept off limits for national security reasons. Transaction costs run modest. Notary fees and the land register state fee together typically total €400 to €900, and Estonia's e-notary system lets many foreign buyers complete the purchase remotely, without flying in. What that purchase does not buy is a place to live legally long-term. Unlike Portugal, Spain, or Greece, Estonia runs no golden visa scheme. Owning property here creates no residency pathway at all. A non-EU buyer who purchases an apartment in Tallinn is still bound by the same 90-day Schengen limit as any tourist, unless they separately qualify for the Digital Nomad Visa or another legal status. Forward-looking estimates from property research firm Investropa rank expected appreciation by property type. Detached houses leading at around 6% annual growth, townhouses next at roughly 5%, new-build apartments at 4 to 5%, and secondary market apartments trailing at 2 to 3%. If that pattern holds, the gap between new build and resale pricing in Tallinn, already wide at €4,540 versus €2,871 per square meter, is more likely to widen than close. Property tax itself is comparatively light. Land tax on residential property in Estonia ranges from 0.1 to 1% of assessed land value, and in Tallinn specifically the applied rate is 0.5%, with homeowner exemptions of up to €1,000 available to reduce the bill further. It's a modest ongoing cost next to the purchase price itself, though it applies regardless of whether the owner is a local resident or a foreign investor holding the apartment empty. Financing that purchase looks different depending on which side of the two-economy line a buyer sits on. Numbio's dataset lists an average 20-year fixed mortgage rate around 3.65% for local buyers. Foreign buyers, including U.S. citizens, can access mortgages from major banks like Swedbank, SEB, and LHV, but typically face stricter documentation requirements and higher down payments. The compliance cost of lending across borders, rather than a rate difference tied to nationality itself. Most of the rental and sale listings behind these figures come from Estonia's two dominant property platforms, City24 and KV.ee, the same portals cited by Land Board and industry analysts throughout this episode. Both operate primarily in Estonian and English, which keeps the local and foreign sides of the housing market unusually visible to each other. anyone can browse the same listings a local buyer sees. Owning a home in Tallinn is difficult on a local salary. Getting around the city, on the other hand, remains one of the least expensive parts of living here. And that goes back to the line this episode opened with. In March 2012, Tallinn residents voted in a referendum on whether to make public transport free for anyone registered as living in the city. It passed. Since January 2013, Tallinn has been the largest city in the world to offer fully free buses, trams, and, until their 2024 retirement for fleet replacement, trolleybuses to its registered residents. That policy remains in place through 2026. In April 2024, when a new city coalition formed after local elections, all four governing parties confirmed they were keeping free transit for residents, a decision reported directly by Estonia's public broadcaster, ERR. Some tourist-facing guides published this year described the free fare program as having ended in January 2024. That claim does not match the city's own reporting or ERR's coverage of the coalition agreement, and this series treats the residents' ride-free policy as active. The catch, unchanged since 2013, is that the free ride applies only to people formally registered as Tallinn residents, a status tied to municipal registration, not simply an address. Visitors and unregistered residents pay per ride, with Numbeo listing a single fare around €2 and a regular monthly pass at €30. For a foreign remote worker who hasn't yet registered locally, that €30 a month is a real cost their Estonian neighbor, 3 registration forms away, doesn't carry at all. Driving remains the more expensive way to move around. Gasoline averages €1.67 a liter. A taxi starts at €4 and adds roughly €1.69 per mile. A new compact car, like a Volkswagen Golf equivalent, starts around €25,000, a price local salaries absorb far less easily than the free tram does. Tallinn's closest economic comparison isn't Riga or Vilnius. It's Helsinki, 80 kilometers north across the Gulf of Finland. Numbeo's city-to-city comparison estimates that someone would need around €4,442 in Tallinn to match the standard of living €5,500 buys in Helsinki, assuming both are renting. That gap is exactly what drives a small but steady population of cross-border commuters and remote workers who bank in euros but live on the cheaper side of the water. The ferry that connects the two capitals runs close to a dozen times a day, operated mainly by Tallink, Viking Line, and Eckerö Line. The crossing takes roughly 2 to 2.5 hours, and one-way fares start around €15 to €20 for a foot passenger, climbing well above that during peak weekend travel. It's cheap enough and frequent enough that some Helsinki-based workers use Tallinn as a lower-cost base, while commuting in only a few days a week, an arrangement that exists entirely outside anything Estonia's own visa system tracks. The free transit policy was never purely altruistic. City officials have reported that municipal income tax revenue from newly registered residents, drawn in partly by the promise of free rides, outweighs the roughly €20 million a year the city forgoes in fare revenue. Every 1,000 new registrations, by the city's own estimate, adds close to €1 million in local tax income. The free tram, in other words, pays for itself by pulling tax residency toward Tallinn rather than a neighboring municipality. Within Estonia itself, Elron's commuter trains extend the free transit logic outward from the capital, linking Tallinn to the wider Harju County and towns further out, though Elron fares are calculated separately from the city's resident-free system and aren't covered by it. Healthcare in Estonia runs on a model that splits cleanly along the same line as everything else in this episode, whether you're plugged into the local employment system or standing outside it. The Estonian Health Insurance Fund, Tervisekassa, formerly known as Haigekassa, is funded by a 13% social tax that employers pay on top of wages, part of a broader 33% social tax contribution. Anyone legally employed by an Estonian company is automatically enrolled. Coverage includes GP visits, specialist care, hospital treatment, and subsidized prescriptions, with small co-payments, typically €5 at a family doctor's office, and €5 to €15 for a specialist. A digital nomad on Estonia's remote work visa is, by design, not employed by an Estonian company, which means they fall entirely outside Tervisekassa. There was a government-backed pilot project, Nomad Security, that explored opening the public fund to residents worldwide. It did not succeed, partly because a national solidarity-funded system isn't built to process foreign currency reimbursements or to underwrite health risk it can't screen at the border. So the requirement for anyone on the Digital Nomad Visa is private international health insurance, valid across the Schengen area, with a minimum coverage level of €30,000. Reported monthly premiums for that kind of policy generally fall between roughly €100 and €170, though barebones nomad travel plans from providers like Safety Wing can start closer to €45 a month, a wide enough range that the actual figure depends heavily on age, coverage depth, and provider. Prescription medicines under Tervisakassa are subsidized at rates between 50 and 90% depending on the drug, a benefit that, like everything else in the public system, only applies to those enrolled in it. A Digital Nomad Visa holder buying the same prescription pays the full private market price, since their €30,000 travel-style insurance policy typically isn't structured for ongoing subsidized pharmacy access the way Tervisakassa is. Numbio's 2025 Healthcare Index ranked Estonia's system 10th in Europe, and the country's digital health infrastructure is genuinely unusual. Over 99% of prescriptions are issued digitally, and both patients and doctors can pull a full medical history through the National Tervisa portal. Specialist waiting times, meanwhile, typically run 2 to 8 weeks. A gap private clinics exist specifically to shorten, for a fee. One change specific to 2026 is worth flagging for anyone moving as a couple. As of February 1st, 2026, Estonia discontinued automatic Tervisakassa coverage for non-working dependent spouses in most cases. A spouse can still be insured under specific conditions, raising a child under 8, or within 5 years of retirement age. But outside those categories, a non-working partner now needs their own coverage route, public or private. €130. That's roughly the midpoint of the monthly private insurance range a Digital Nomad Visa holder budgets for health coverage. A bill a locally employed Tallinner never sees, because it's already built into their employer's 33% social tax contribution. None of this, the free tram, the subsidized doctor's visit, the automatic insurance enrollment, is available to someone who hasn't found a way to legally reside here. And that is where the two economies this episode has been tracing actually originate, at the visa office. Estonia taxes income at a flat 20% rate, applied identically whether the taxpayer is a local employee or a foreign remote worker. One of the few points in this episode where the two economies actually meet on equal terms. The catch for Digital Nomad Visa holders is the 183-day rule. Spend more than half of any 12-month period physically in Estonia, and that flat rate applies to them too, on top of whatever tax obligations they still carry at home. For EU and EEA citizens, this section is short. Freedom of movement means no visa is required at all, only registration of residence with local authorities, the same process that unlocks the free tram. For everyone else, Estonia offers something it was first in the world to create, a dedicated Digital Nomad Visa, launched in 2020, letting remote workers and freelancers legally live in Estonia while working for employers or clients based entirely outside the country. The income bar for that visa has moved. For several years, the published threshold was €3,504 a month, set at roughly 1.5 times the national average salary at the time. Multiple sources updated through early 2026, including immigration advisory firm Jobbatical, now report the requirement raised to €4,500 a month in gross income, verified across the 6 months immediately preceding application. Older guides still circulating online continue to cite the €3,504 figure. This series follows the more recently dated sources and treats €4,500 as the current threshold, while flagging that both numbers exist in current circulation. For €1,500, that's the minimum a remote worker must prove every month for 6 months before Estonia will let them move here on this visa. Set that figure against the numbers from earlier in this episode. It's nearly double Tallinn's own average gross salary of €2,538. It's more than double and a half the national median gross salary of €1,753. The visa, in other words, is not built for someone trying to match a local paycheck. It's built for someone earning well above what most people actually earn in the city they're moving to. The visa itself runs for up to a year, split between a short-stay Type C option, up to 90 days, and a long-stay Type D, up to 365 days. It does not renew, and it does not lead toward permanent residency. Anyone who wants to stay longer has to find a different legal pathway before the year runs out. Health insurance with that €30,000 minimum coverage is a mandatory part of the application, not an afterthought. One distinction trips up a lot of people researching this move. Estonia's e-residency program is not this visa and doesn't function like one. E-residency is a digital identity that lets someone run an EU-registered company entirely online from anywhere in the world. It grants no right to enter Estonia, live there, or even visit, a detail that's easy to miss in marketing material that treats Digital Estonia as a single, simple pitch. Applying for the Digital Nomad Visa itself is a relatively contained process. Applications go through the Estonian Police and Border Guard Board, either directly or via a Schengen consulate, and processing typically takes 15 to 30 days. The application fee sits around €100. What takes longer, in practice, is assembling 6 consecutive months of income documentation that satisfies the €4,500 threshold. Bank statements, invoices, or employment contracts, translated and formatted to a standard Estonian officials will accept without follow-up questions. Non-EU workers who do land a job with an actual Estonian employer follow a different track entirely. A standard temporary residence permit for employment, which does count against that 1,292 slot 2026 quota, but which also plugs them directly into Tervisekassa through their employer's social tax contributions. It's a slower, more bureaucratic path than the Digital Nomad Visa, but it's the one that actually connects a newcomer to the local side of this episode's 2 economies, rather than leaving them permanently on the private insurance, pay-per-ride side. It's worth setting Tallinn's numbers against the 2 other Baltic capitals this series has already covered. Riga, in episode 5, carried a 2026 Numbeo cost of living score of 54.9. Vilnius, not yet covered in this series but tracked in the same index, scored 53.0. Tallinn's 64.8 puts it meaningfully above both of its closest regional peers, a gap that lines up with Estonia's higher wages, but also with a housing and services market climbing faster than Latvia's or Lithuania's. Estonia's broader immigration system caps non-EU work and business residence permits at 1,292 slots for 2026. The Digital Nomad Visa sits outside that quota entirely, which is part of why the government continues to promote it even as the country tightens other immigration channels. Line up every pillar in this episode side by side, and one side of Tallinn's economy is a city that takes remarkably good care of the people already inside its systems. Free transit, subsidized healthcare, and grocery prices among the lowest in Northern Europe, funded, in large part, by a 33% social tax collected from local employment. The other side is a city where none of that applies until someone proves they don't need it. A remote worker qualifying for residency must already earn close to double the local average salary, then pay privately for the health coverage a local employee gets automatically, then pay for every tram ride a registered neighbor rides free. Property sits in the middle of both economies, indifferent to which one you belong to. A €4,540 per square meter new build listing in central Tallinn costs the same euro whether it's paid for by someone earning the city's €2,538 average wage, or someone clearing the visa's €4,500 income floor. It's simply a much larger fraction of one paycheck than the other. Childcare draws the same line one more time. A Tallinn family enrolled in the public system pays nothing in tuition. A foreign family needing English language instruction is looking at €9,166 a year per child, on top of everything else in this episode. It's a small pillar next to rent or property, but it compounds every year a family stays. Go back to that one line on the monthly budget that reads zero. The free tram ride, the referendum one policy Tallinn has now kept for over a decade. It's a small thing to build a closing thought around, but it's also the clearest single marker in this episode of which economy you're actually standing in. The one where getting to work costs nothing, or the one where getting permission to work here in the first place costs 4,500 euros a month, proven 6 times over, before you've paid for anything else. So the question isn't really whether Tallinn is affordable. It's this: affordable for the resident the system was built around, or affordable for the remote worker the visa was built to select for. Because those two answers, on the numbers in this episode, are no longer close to the same thing.